Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, everyone. We have an international audience today and international speakers, so it's a very exciting day for us. So our topic today is what's new in the EU, and this session will focus on developments in the European CCUS and CDR markets and what they mean for Canada's technology and project developers. As always, we like to give our land acknowledgement. So with gratitude and respect, we acknowledge that the lands on which we operate in are the traditional, ancestral, and unceded territories of the First Nations, Inuit, and Métis people. I'm coming in from the lands of the Haudenosaunee and Anishinaabe peoples and the Dish with One Spoon, One Pum agreement. If you would like to put your land acknowledgement in the chat, we always appreciate that. As always, Carbon Next is run by Carbon Management Canada and Foresight Canada. We are a partnership that operate Carbon Next, which is our CCUS accelerator. And our agenda today, so I will run through a quick intro, and then we are launching our Carbon Next Year 1 report. So we've been working on this report for a while, and it is highlights our entire first year of this project, our different cohorts, the ventures we've supported, and our wins and plans going forward. So we have a link at the end. You are encouraged to look at it. We are very excited about it. Our panelist presentations, we have Pascal Hader-Weinmann from the German Energy Agency. We have Sam Bowers from the Clean Air Task Force, and we have Marion Kruger from Remove. So a great lineup of speakers. And once they are done their presentations, we are headed over to our Q&A. So at any point, if you have questions, please feel free to drop them in the chat and we can get to them. So this is just a brief intro for our year 1 report. The link is at the end of the presentation and we will send it out at the end, but we are very excited about it and looking forward to any feedback you have about this. And with that, I will hand it over to the exciting part of the webinar. So I will hand it over to Pascal first.
That was very quick. Thank you very much for the introduction. And thank you for the opportunity to talk about German CCS development and or in particular German CCS development, but also put it into context and with European dynamics, which Marion and Sam will talk more about. So thank you for the invite, Shannon, Foresight Canada and Carbon Management Canada. I'm Pascal. I lead a team at the German Energy Agency that's concerned with carbon management. And as such, we are at the moment coordinating the German national carbon management strategy. So I'm happy to share some of our insights and in particular talk a bit about the peculiarities of German CCUS debate. So Shannon, you could put on the next slide, please, or whoever's. Yes, thank you. Actually, the focus of my talk should be what's up at the moment in Germany regarding CCUS, but you won't be able to understand that if you don't have a bit of a background of German CCS history. Those of you that know German CCS debate will have heard this multiple times, but still, once again, for those who haven't. So now that we're talking about CCS isn't the first time we did so. So we tried doing that around 10 to 15 years ago. So in 2009, the European Union adopted the CCS law, and we started to talk about equipping our power plants, or some of our power plants, with pilot capture installations to try out this new technology, kind of. So it was mainly concerned with CCS at lignite power plants here in Germany. And what you can see on that picture are 2 examples of relatively harsh public protests against this technology. So there were protests about CCS being CO2 repository and just a geoengineering solutions that's meant to prolong fossil fuel industry. Many harsh words were lost, and not much sympathy found within the public, within NGOs, and also within certain political parties. This then led to the situation that the implementation of the CCS law in national legislation was very restrictive. So our national CCS law, adopted in 2012, limited CCS projects to research purposes, and on top it provided the federal states in Germany with a right to prohibit the storage after all, so and altogether, and also included an application deadline for new storage projects. And this deadline ended in 2016. There were no applications for any storage projects. So as of now, it's just not possible to implement any CCS projects because you cannot store CO2 in Germany. You cannot legally export CO2 in Germany, and you cannot really use it because that's also a bit tricky under a CCS regulation. So there's just no way you would install a capture plant because you cannot do anything with it. Next slide, please. Things changed. Otherwise, I wouldn't be standing here talking about the carbon management strategy. And what kind of things changed, you can see here on this this graph. So there was so that's kind of the chronology of the renaissance of CCS in Germany. The most important thing, of course, that changed was a different climate target. So we set ourselves a climate neutrality target for the year 2045, and what was different to the one before that, you now needed to get down to 100%, and there and studies in following the target showed there's just no way to go from 80 or 85 to 100% without CCS. So on the next slide, you see the results of some of the national carbon studies that analyze possible ways to go forward with, or to transform German energy system towards climate neutrality, and they all concluded that we will need CCS by 2030 and in 2045 in significant numbers. So this was the moment where all the debate and discussion in Germany picked up again, because we saw we needed carbon capture after all. On the next slide, it's just highlighted that the government agreed with it then. So we had a new government, and we've seen, okay, carbon management is, after all, important. And our ministry announced a federal carbon management strategy, so CMS is short for carbon management strategy, but for the German industry. And that is kind of a particularity of German debate, which we'll dive on into later more probably, because we're not talking about CCS and power plants or many other sectors, but we only talk about CCS at the moment in Germany in industry. And coincidentally, in the same year, in 2022, there was the evaluation report of this mentioned CCS law due, and Dena and my team supported the ministry with drafting this law. And on the next slide, you see that we come up with several fields of action. So what we did here in this evaluation report, we summarized the state of CCS international and nationally, and concluded that we are way behind in Germany. We cannot really do anything about CCS, but other countries are frontrunners like Norway, Denmark, and so on. And we needed to start getting all the framework right. So what we said here was that, first of all, we need to set the basic requirements right. So we need to define a legal framework, and particular to Germany, even define possible areas of application, develop a robust MRV system, and create incentive systems for the CCS infrastructure, for CO2 infrastructure, for clusters, or for carbon cycles to develop. And more important in Germany than in most other countries, this bottom line of clear communication and a positive societal narrative. So we're all in the moment of creating a narrative that's different to the narrative that was there before. So we now want to see CCS as part of the solution, and not as a means to prolong any fossil business models. Yeah. So this is kind of the main highlight and conclusion that we arrived at. So we needed to have the avoidance of CO2 emissions first. So decarbonization through electrification and energy efficiency measures is just priority, and should continue to be the priority, no matter how much CCS we will use. And this is kind of the premise that we're working under from that time on. Next slide, please, and the next slide as well. So we're now developing a federal carbon management strategy, and in this strategy we are defining, first of all, what sectors are hard to abate, because they will have a definite requirement for CCS, and our assumption is that there will be a higher societal consensus around those sectors then. So main work that to be done is to show what sectors will need CCS, how much CCS they will need, and what to do to kind of develop it. So what we're doing is we are conducting pretty thorough scenario analysis to kind of get an estimate about volumes of carbon dioxide for transport and storage. So there's a range of we will see what that range looks like, but we want to get an understanding of how much CO2 we're talking about. And the focus is industry and waste incineration here. And we're kind of excluding all CCS at power plants. And then one thing that's particular in Germany as well is we're really trying, or at least we at DENA are trying to differentiate between CCUS for emissions reduction on the one hand, and CDR on the other hand. And on the political side, it's also that we have two different strategies. We have a strategy which is the carbon management strategy for emissions reductions, and we have a CDR strategy, the so-called long-term strategy for negative emissions. And with that, we might become one of the first countries to set ourselves targets for negative emissions for both LULUCF-based and CCS-based CDR, or technology-based CDR. So that might be a new, and it could happen this year, next year. So our CMS, the carbon management strategy, will now need to provide the regulatory framework for the uptake of CCS in Germany. Last two slides. So what I was talking about now is to get the regulatory framework right, and that as of now industry cannot really act because storage is prohibited, export is prohibited, and so on. However, industry action is kind of already underway. They're kind of waiting for government to set the framework right and then to start off. So we see different storage options being developed, and I'm certain that Sam and Marianne will talk about this more in detail. In Denmark, the Netherlands, Norway, the UK, all different storage projects are being developed, and this year, the first commercial cross-national transport and storage of CO2 happened in the project Greensand in Denmark. And in Germany, of course, again, discussion is very different. So there's, at the moment, we don't see any way that we will store CO2 onshore. There's just no political backing and societal backing for that. But we want to kind of think about all different solutions, and priority might be the export of CO2, but we'll also look into possible offshore storage options in German offshore areas. Then we have private actors that are far ahead of the political discussion. So we have infrastructure operators who have several projects in an advanced planning phase, mainly grid transport for CO2. And you see this on the map, or here on the German landscape here on the right side, with the first sections that are planned to be operational by 2028. And at the same time, all those kind of hard to abate, or for us unavoidable emission, or unavoidable industry with unavoidable emissions, they are starting to think, plan, and prepare for execution of CCS projects. So there are two lime and cement plants that are far along their planning phase, and they want to capture multiple megatons of CO2. but we know of several other plans of several other actors that are ready to capture and store CO2 within this decade, as soon as we give them the proper regulatory framework. So this lets us arrive at the conclusions and takeaways that I'm gonna kind of propose here and talk about it with you later on. So we see that CCS is a very controversial topic within Germany, pretty different to the situation in North America. We have a greater acceptance rate of CCU, but it's not very known in broader German society. And of course, CCS is considered mostly for sectors with otherwise hard to abate emissions, which is why we need very thorough analysis, a participatory process, and transparent communication to really get going with the implementation of CCS, because otherwise we face the risks that it will all get kind of shut down, like once again, like it happened again in the year 2012 something. And for that, we need the carbon management strategy, which is due this year. So we are currently in the midst of drafting this strategy, and hopefully we will get it past legislation, so that there will be a proper regulatory framework for CCS in the coming months, or at least hopefully within this year. Yes, and that's kind of the takeaways from the German perspective, and I'm happy to discuss broader European developments with Marion and Sam later on. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Pascal. That was great. I learned a lot. The net negative strategy is very interesting, so I'm hoping we can dig a little more into that. And with that, I will pass it over to Sam with the Clean Air Task Force.
Thanks, Shannon, and thanks, Pascal. I completely agree with one of your concluding remarks that kind of participation, clear communication is going to be key for kind of the social license of CCS in a lot of European countries, but also we're seeing that in the US as well. So good morning, everyone, and thank you to Carbon Management Canada and Foresight Canada. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to you all about what's happening in Europe. I'll be focusing on point source primarily. Also wanted to add that I spent most of my adult life in Canada, so very pleased to have the opportunity to kind of speak with you all. Next slide, please. So quick intro on kind of who we are. CATF is a US-based non-profit advocacy organization and think tank. We work in the US, Europe, and the Middle East. And we advocate for climate risk management and emissions reduction through our buzzwords are kind of technology and policy optionality, and CCS is going to be a key part of that approach. And our vision is to meet the world's rising energy demand in a way that is financially, socially, and environmentally sustainable. Shannon, you can actually skip through 2 slides because, yes. So this is our CCS tracker map, kind of spotlighting Europe. So I'll kind of quickly go through what is the current state of CCS in Europe. Right now, we are tracking over 70 proposed projects. Excuse me. As you can see from the map, the proposed projects are largely based around storage operations in the North Sea. There's kind of a clear clustering you can see between the UK and the northern coast of continental Europe. As Pascal kind of highlighted for us, in general in Europe, there's a clear focus on industrial emissions, kind of rather than power. And if you look at the orange spots on the map, we see many industrial hubs proposed, especially around the North Sea, as I mentioned, and a lot of blue, and a lot of kind of blue hydrogen production as well. And you can also see this like proposed cement facilities. So those are the kind of light blue dots that you see. And because so much of the storage is offshore, many of these projects are going to be reliant on shipping and some rail transport to actually get the CO2 to port. There's only 2 operational plants at scale right now. The first is Sleipner, which was the world's first, and its sister project, which is the world's first CCS, commercial CCS project, started in '96. And I'm sure many of you are going to be familiar with that. And the second one is the Orca project up in Iceland, which is a direct air capture facility. That said, there are several projects that are expected to come online this year, and one of those I've kind of highlighted in the next slide. So next slide, please. Yes. So this is the Brevik CCS plant in Europe. This is actually a picture of the capture unit there in the truck being delivered. So we expect this to be the world's first CO2 capture facility. And it's supposed to be operational Q3 of next year. Sorry, not this year. And it's led by Heidelberg Materials. I think this picture is also interesting because it highlights a feature of many European CCS projects, which is they're going to be located relatively near to people, which is just a function of kind of Europe's density, which means, the social license piece that, Pascal mentioned is particularly important. So now I'm going to kind of talk about recent policy developments. So next slide, please, Shannon. So last October, the EU the Commission announced a industrial carbon management strategy, which is going to provide the political framework to scale CCS in Europe. And we expect it to do a few things. So first, provide a roadmap for scaling CCS in Europe by 2030, 2040, and then 2050. It's going to propose measures to achieve the deployment of EU-wide CO2 transport and storage infrastructure, which I'll touch on in a bit, which is going to be extremely important to bring down the costs for CCS in Europe. And this strategy is going to be supported by similar initiatives at the member state level. So, for example, the carbon management strategy in Germany, which Pascal kind of walked us through earlier. I'd want to highlight now in the next slide a kind of major carbon capture and storage breakthrough policy-wise kind of in Europe, which is in the Net Zero Industry Act. So this sets an EU-wide storage target of 50 million tons per year by 2030, and first such a proposal at the EU level. And why we and others are particularly excited about this, because it kind of breaks the chicken and egg problem of CCS infrastructure. And there's a clear responsibility on oil and gas producers because they have the know-how to store that CO2, which is also kind of a world first, I believe. And the NZIA also includes important elements around kind of faster CO2 storage site permitting, which is going to be key as well. It also includes an obligation for member states to share storage data and declare their own carbon capture and storage plans. I should caveat this all by saying right now this is a proposal. This is a proposal from the European Commission, which does the kind of agenda setting and policy development for Europe. It still needs to be reviewed by the Council of the European Union, which is made up of government ministers from each EU country. Their position on this is TBD. And the European Parliament is currently reviewing this, and we expect them to make the proposal more ambitious. So in theory, they would kind of make elements of this enforceable with fines. So next slide, please. I just want to briefly touch on kind of the ETS. So the political framework for CCS will be included in the Industrial Carbon Management Strategy, which is going to be launched later this year. And the Net Zero Industry Act addresses some of the bottlenecks, the infrastructure bottlenecks like access to storage. But the primary driver right now is the ETS, which is about $90, which is Europe's cap and trade scheme. The ETS is projected to rise to over 120 euros, not dollars. And it's expected to rise from around 90 to 120 by 2030. But as you will see in the next slide, it's unclear to what extent the price of 120 euros per ton is going to make a business case for all the industries, all the applications for CCS. So next slide, please, Shannon. in the status quo, which is you can see in the first panel on the left, this reflects planned storage sites only, which we included on our map kind of at the top of the presentation. And if we consider planned storage only, then in some parts of Europe, so in particular Central and Eastern Europe, which is represented by the dark blue spots, the cost of transport and storage is going to be up to 175 euros per ton. So there's no way the ETS kind of makes that viable. However, with proper policy, we can bring down these costs. So if you look at the middle panel, this is what happens to the costs when all suitable geology is considered. So that's both onshore and offshore. So a significantly greater kind of expansion of potential storage sites. And the final panel on the right shows what will happen to the cost if kind of new pipelines are also built across Europe. And that will bring the cost down to 15 to 30 euros per ton, which is on par with the US currently. So US onshore, I should say. So I'm conscious of time, so maybe I'll run through these a little quicker. Next slide. This is a bit of so this compares very few storage options versus what happens when we dramatically build out CO2 storage. And the transport cost is significantly higher in the scenario on the left, up to 3 times. These black lines don't represent pipelines, just kind of distance from point sources to sinks. And on the right, we have a kind of a much more distributed access to storage, which brings down the cost. And next slide, if you want to learn more about this, you can play around with our CCS cost tool, which is very helpful, which shows you different scenarios and the cost implications for transport and storage for each scenario. So next slide. So there are still policy and funding gaps. Right now, there's only one storage project under construction. And there are 3 other ones where kind of an FID has been made, and these are all associated with Norway's Northern Lights project. So there is not enough. There is currently not enough deployment happening, and this is because most projects still face an economic shortfall, and the emitters face inadequate access to storage. So this is kind of why the NZIA is so important. Next slide. If we compare different approaches, and I'm about to wrap up, just a couple more slides. So if we compare different approaches, I'm sorry we don't have a Canadian slide here. CATF doesn't operate in Canada, but I'm sure many of you are familiar with what's happening in the US. So the US is very deployment focused. It's incentives driven with 45Q, and they don't prioritize end use applications. Whereas in Europe, it's much more planning, top-down planning focus. It's deployment's largely driven by the ETS, which kind of, as we've highlighted, is not high enough for most industries. And we prioritize hard to abate sectors rather than power. And the outcomes of this is kind of Europe has significantly less development than the US. It's primarily on low CO2 concentration applications, and it's primarily offshore storage. Whereas in the US, we have primarily onshore storage, high CO2 concentration applications like ethanol, and significantly more advanced development. Just a quick plug for our work. You can find a lot of useful materials on our website. So we published a European strategy for CCS, and are working and co-chaired the Commission's working group on a CCS vision, which was published this January, and you can also play around with the cost map. I will end there and kind of look forward to answering some of your questions, and happy to kind of discuss any of this offline as well.
Great, Sam, thank you so much. That photo with the facility right in a neighborhood, that's unheard of in North America. So that was really interesting to see from my perspective. And with that, I will pass it over to Marianne from Remove.
Thanks, Shannon. Yeah, as you can see, I didn't prepare slides, which I think I still have plenty to share, and I appreciated Sam's emphasis on transport, because I think that's something that is often overlooked in the discussion, thinking about the more tangible ones, which is capture and storage. We actually, in my previous role at leading the sustainability and business lab at ETH Zurich, which is sort of a decarbonization think tank, we're working a lot on CCS, and we actually ended up calling it CCTUS to emphasize that transport aspect, because it just got heavily overlooked at times. Right now, as you can see, I'm part of Remove. So Remove is a nonprofit organization that runs an accelerator program for carbon removal startups in Europe. It was developed at ETH and now spun off. But during my time at ETH, I also have had plenty of experience working on CCS topics, both in Switzerland and Europe. And I want to speak a bit about the European innovation ecosystem, precisely because with Remove, we have a very good bird's eye perspective on things that are happening in Europe, given our geographic focus and our openness towards any carbon removal solution. We have supported up 60 startups up until now, and at the end of this year, we'll have 100 that have gone through the program. So there's plenty of activity happening, and some of them are on the more engineered side, and some of them are actually also point source CCS solutions on then biogenic waste streams, for instance. So I wanted to touch on 3 points where I see sort of the strengths, but also the gaps in the innovation ecosystem in Europe. The first one being research and commercialization. It's very clear, at least from the application and startups that we see that, and that's also not surprising, most of the innovation happens where the big research universities are located in Europe. So you have ETH Zurich, you have the cluster around Oxford and Cambridge, Imperial, Chalmers, TU Munich. This is where Europe, I think, also really excels at and is on par with North America when it comes to research. Now, the problem is when you think about commercializing that research, and that is a big challenge and a big gap that I think we Europeans still struggle with. But one, because the academic structures fundamentally do not incentivize entrepreneurship, and they make it unnecessarily hard to spin out technologies. I know from startups that have spun out of universities in the US or also in Canada that things are a lot more entrepreneurial over there, just in terms of the agreements on equity you can find or licensing agreements. I think the second reason here why this is a challenge is there's a funding gap for the earliest days of a startup's life or a technology's life. So when a startup or technology is too mature for a university grant, but not yet validated enough for the earliest stages of VC, that's where there is a clear gap in Europe and also in the national countries and grant schemes. We as a program do give out a bit of non-dilutive grants, especially exactly to cover this sort of transition period. In the US and Canada, we do see, for one, philanthropy stepping in here a lot more comfortably than in Europe. And two, also the VCs are willing to jump in here a lot earlier and take on more risk. Plus, there's also more public money available. So that is a clear gap that we see when looking at Europe. There's plenty of great research, but we still struggle to put it out on the street by making this transition possible. The second one, why I also think this is so sad to a degree, is because the market in principle, the European content market is there to adopting these CCTUS and CDR solutions, right? So many of the industries that Pascal and Sam also talked about that we consider hard to abate, really drive the economies in the European continent, they're part of the European Emissions Trading Scheme, the ETS, right? So they're forced to decarbonize sooner or later. And by that, there's clear market demand for these solutions. And then on the CDR side, theoretically, I mean, a lot of the European corporates tend to have more aggressive net zero pledges and goals than their North American counterparts, right? So there's a clear aspiration and a clear pressure also on them to act on these. However, we don't see that 100% reflected yet in the procurement data for carbon removal, for instance. I do believe we'll see more of that as the corporates need to move from pledging and planning to action. And so on that end, I do not worry about a continental European market for these solutions to be there. I think a clear difference here between CCTUS solutions and CDR is the fact that, as Sam and Pascal outlined so nicely, CCTUS tends to be part of a compliance regime, right? Where it's very clear that there is going to be a market and that market demand is quite plannable. Whereas in CDR, the demand is vulnerable because it's fundamentally voluntary on the voluntary market. And that makes it really, really a struggle for early stage companies because you cannot bank on your solutions really being needed. After all, if the economy shifts into a downturn, one of the first things that might fall off of a company's procurement plan is to buy carbon removal because fundamentally it's voluntary. And also it makes customer discovery very hard. So typically, if you had a regular solution, a product, if you sold to one customer, then chances are you might be able to sell to customers that are of the same type. But in CDR, just because, say, Adidas bought CDR, that doesn't mean that Puma will also do so. So that is quite challenging for startups to make sense of in that market environment. And the third thing that I want to touch upon is policy. I think we've heard plenty of it. I want to pick up on it from a bit of a macro perspective. I think, in principle, Europe is quite progressive when it comes to it, but the process of getting things done is, of course, also quite slow, given the fact that, we are, after all, lots of national countries ingrained in this one European entity. And that can prove challenging because policy insecurity slows down innovation and deployment. We already see that for CC2S, but also very clearly in CDR, where some of our startups have potential customers who are willing to buy carbon removal from them, but they're waiting on the EU Commission to come out with the carbon removal certification framework, which basically sets the standard on quality of what carbon removal is and what it is not. And until that is there's nothing really happening, and that is stalling development on that end. So this, policy insecurity can pose challenges. Interestingly, I think, looking at it from a global scale, I do believe the way that things work in Europe to get to agreements on regulations and policy can almost be seen as sort of a petri dish for things that will need to happen on a global level. Right? We also will need to agree on quality parameters for carbon removal, not just continentally in Europe, but beyond that on a global level as well. So maybe there's something to learn here. The last thing I wanted to leave us with is sort of what we've done in Switzerland, which of course is not part of the EU, and in that regard has a bit of more freedom, is we've decided to really precedent action before waiting until everything is clear. So one, I think, relevant project in this context is a project called Demo Up Karma, where we have been shipping 1,000 tons of biogenic CO2 from a biogas upgrader in Switzerland over truck, rail, and ship up to Iceland to store it with Carbfix, just to see what will happen, because a lot of the questions we hadn't answered, but just to make sure we can answer them while we're doing them, and also to show that it works. And it has been remarkable what of an effect this has had on policymakers, just because academia and industry just moved ahead and did it, not asking for permission, but rather for forgiveness. So I think that's, something that I want to leave all of us with. I know there's constraints, but sort of in these small sandbox examples, I think that is a great way to move things forward.
Great, thank you so much, Marian. It's interesting your perspective on the entrepreneurship landscape in Europe, because we also think that there's a big gap here in funding, but clearly in Europe it's even larger. It's an even larger problem to solve. So thank you everybody for your opening remarks, and we're going to head over to our Q&A period now. We do have a question in the chat from Wilma. So if you, I'm posing this to everybody. She doesn't underestimate the importance of CCUS. However, the utilization part should not be neglected but emphasized. Can you talk about how utilization is viewed in the different areas of Europe? And pass that over to Pascal first, maybe.
Sure. So as I quickly touch upon, regarding the societal acceptance, there's a difference. So because storage always has this touch of there's risk involved, and we deposit CO2 somewhere, and what to do with it next, and then what happens if it leaks. And for CCU, there's this kind of two two different narratives here that play into its hand. So first is we create value at some in some form, and that always attracts attention and people like if we do something valuable with it. So CCU is always kind of regarded as if we have CO2, then let's use it. And the other is there's just not as much danger associated with the U than with S, but it is politically and a very difficult topic to talk about CCU, because there's always the question of how do you really account for emissions of fossil CCU, of biogenic CCU. What is the life cycle assessment? And so the easier part is just to take the CO2 and store it, and then it's done. So it is a difficult topic within our national discussion at the moment, because there could be scenarios where we use as much CCU to kind of get our carbon demand that we don't actually need storage. That could happen in some scenarios, but it's just a difficult pathway, because the carbon will be released at some point, and we need to have a closed carbon cycle then, which is very hard to kind of monitor. So that's maybe taken in Germany, but Marian is nodding, so maybe you want to add something.
Yeah, no, I do agree. I think the climate impact in the end is what I am often concerned about, especially if different types or origins of CO2 are not discriminated against correctly or differentiated from exactly, right? If I look at CDR specifically, or let's say biogenic and atmospheric CO2, which would be relevant for CDR, I think there's some clear cases where we will need CCU, like synfuels, for instance, and there's no way around using biogenic or atmospheric CO2 for that in order to really achieve a mitigation outcome. And then the other end is there are interesting long duration or higher duration ways of storing CO2 as well. And I would always prefer those from a CDR perspective, especially if we are working with a constrained resource, which took us a lot of work to get out of the air, be that through photosynthesis or even through direct air capture, for instance, or BECCS, to put that in high durability storage like concrete or other building materials, where we can be quite sure that that carbon will stay there for an extended period of time, where the mitigation outcome and the cooling outcome is a significant one.
So CCU looks quite attractive to many eyes, but then or as a way out for the storage problem maybe. But then you have to look at problems like the energy demand you need and the loads of hydrogen you need for CCU, and then the technologies are just not there yet at the moment. So from a climate perspective, we want to start now, and if we want to start now, we have to do something with it. And CCU on a large scale, at least in Europe, is not a good option at the moment.
These are great responses. I would just add that in general, there is very little public awareness of CCS or CCU in Europe, and it's volatile, right? Or in the sense, it's community based. A lot of it is dependent on the outreach and it's project specific. So I've not seen any polling on CCS versus CCU, but in general, we see as in Germany, people are against past projects. Norway, people are in favor for it, and then you've got countries like Netherlands, let's say the UK, where there is much less public opposition and even acceptance. So, like I think any country, engagement is done well with the right stakeholders and in the right place. There will be acceptance kind of CCS or CCU. We need policymakers to lead and send clear message that CCS is a legitimate and essential climate solution. And people can't hear about it for the first time when a developer just shows up on their doorstep. We need political messaging and all the kind of stakeholders to be aligned.
Great, thank you, Sam, and thank you, Pascal and Marianne. Those are great responses. We do have a question. So Anne, if you want to unmute yourself, please feel free.
Hello. So I'm the one who asked that question, but I don't know why it show a very different name. So hello, I'm Anne, and I'm co-founder of Kuntech, a startup in the Foresight, Canada too, but in the Earth Tech program right now. And I'm a freshly graduate from ETH Zurich also last year. So see ya. Just moved to Canada last year after graduating, and I starting my startup about CO2 utilization. And what we do is we try to transform CO2 emission into different kind of products, but different kind of technologies also. And I acknowledge that the utilization part is not very well known because there's a very limited application from CO2 also. That's why people on focus on the storage part. And I stop. I am also trying to driving the utilization part, because I believe to store such gigatons of CO2 is not a very sustainable solution for long term. And what I encounter as a challenge for staff in this field is what Maren just says is totally right, and the lack of willingness from, especially from venture capitalists for hard tech companies, really require very intense capitals. But also when I contact some potential customer, they all ask me, they are interested in the technology, but they are all asking that, can you help us remove like some 100,000 tons of CO2 per year? That's it impossible for a startup that we're starting from the lab scale and we're slowly moving up. And to achieve that scale right away is not possible. So my two questions is, do you know, or maybe I lack of knowledge, is there any pilot project that willing to accept like start in the middle stage out of the lab, but going to not the industrialization, but in the middle? And the second is, as I have a connection with Switzerland, and I study on my master and PhD in Europe. I have strong connection with Europe too. So is there any project that collaborates between the North America, Canada, and Europe available in this field? Thanks.
Thanks, Anne. So to recap the question, are there any programs or pilots available for startups post lab scale getting into those larger scales? And also, are there any projects that are collaborating between Canada and Europe?
Yeah, that's right. Thank you.
So on the latter, I mean, that's something we might need to think about and work on, Shannon, right? If there's, I'm not aware of any. I mean, there are a few global programs, and those would also be the ones that I point you towards, namely Breakthrough Energy Catalyst, which is really, I think, for the stage where you're at right now, to take something from the lab to commercialization. And maybe if you're a bit too early for that, there's Breakthrough Energy Fellows, which is a bit earlier, when depending on how far you are at with technology development. Yeah, it is a struggle to get to the forest deployment, and you likely will, especially if it's hard tech and deep tech, you will require significant amounts of capital. If sort of you've moved from, say, in terms, if we want to talk VC, if you are at seed level, there's also the C2V program out of the East Coast. NYU and others are working on that. So Carbon to Value, which might actually be the perfect program since you're in utilization route. But right now, from what I gather, you might be a bit too early. So I would keep a lookout for the Breakthrough Energy programs. And there's another one based in the US called Activate. They also have a fellows program. I'm not sure whether that is CCU. They surely have one for CDR. Whether they're open for CCU, I'm not sure.
Great, thank you. I hope that answered your question, Anne. And we can go on to our next one. So for Pascal, how does Germany's CCUS development differ from other countries? And do you see possibilities for Germany to become a front runner?
I think we talked about this for a bit already, but I can try to summarize a couple of things. So, first of all, the main difference we talked about a lot. So there's different scope of CCS in Europe versus the US, and there's a particularly different and more narrow scope for German CCS debate. Because other countries in the EU might be open for different applications as well, or leading the discussions a bit more broader. But here we really need to put our emphasis on hard to abate emissions. And we had kind of this 10-year gap where nothing happened, so we're just starting off discussing CCS again. While other countries like Denmark and Norway have already developed both strategies and projects. So I'm pretty impressed about of the Danish development, even more than the Norway one, to be honest. So because in Denmark, they started a public process, or they had a political consensus that they need to do something, and they had a cross-party agreement on CCS and started developing a strategy, and this was the basis for their current project pipeline, which is quite impressive, and for their pretty broad public support. And also in Norway, we have quite high acceptance for CCS. And in some other countries developing, like Sam showed us on some of those pictures, great projects regarding storage clusters for mainly also, and they often are supported financially by the government or the EU. And here in Germany, we don't really support large-scale projects because we don't have the framework yet. However, I think that there's a couple of reasons that speak for Germany to kind of pick up pace here, because first, we do have significant emissions that need to be dealt with, and a large share of this are energy intensive industry emissions. So we have a large cement and a large steel sector that needs their emissions to be dealt with. And we also have at least some of the know-how that you need, and the companies do want the know-how to be utilized, and for the technologies to be exported as well. So there's quite a lot of pressure on the government to now create the right framework and then set incentives for actions to happen. So as I shown that there are surprisingly many projects that are in an advanced stage already. So I think as soon as we have the strategy and the legislation right, the actions will happen quite swiftly, and then we might even be kind of a country which is in between. So we also have Austria, who needs to deal with their emissions, and they rely on Germany to develop their infrastructure grid for the Austrian emissions to be used. So we might be one of the countries that will pick up pace, and I don't know if we're a front runner, but we will be there sooner than expected, I hope.
Great, thank you. I'm going to pass it over to Sam. What do you see as the largest barriers are for advancing large CCUS projects?
That's a good question. I mean, fundamentally, the ETS price is not high enough, right? And even though we've seen upward trends, it reached 100 euros per ton in February, not going to be enough. It's not going to be enough to drive kind of many sectors. So there's the funding gap against the carbon price, which is the main one, as kind of discussed. And there's also discussed in the kind of the cost maps. We need additional national policies. Carbon contracts for difference is something that many countries are talking about. So countries would pay, or member states, countries like the UK would pay project developers the difference between the ETS price, the cap and trade price, and their actual cost of capture. And the contract for difference would be that delta. So we need, this is already happening in the Netherlands, and it's being considered in other countries. So the funding piece it remains a gap. And in terms of storage, the EU lacks developed storage. It's primarily in the North Sea, but to bring down the costs, we need storage onshore and offshore all over Europe. We need to build beyond the North Sea. And so the Net Zero Industry Act will hopefully alleviate some of this. But it's still going to be very difficult for countries in Central and Eastern Europe, which are some of the kind of larger emitters and the biggest industrial players. We need to bring down the costs of CCS in those countries. So we're going to need pipeline infrastructure, more onshore storage. And fundamentally, like all these things, it takes political will and consistency. So yeah, just to summarize, I would say close the funding gap with policies like carbon contracts for difference. We need to build out significantly more storage to bring down the costs, and we need kind of consistent whole of government approaches to carbon management.
And adding to that, and really stressing the infrastructure point, I suppose, because I think it's not a question of technology and not even of costs. So yes, for the first projects, there might be need for support schemes and some sort of political support, because first large scale project will see comparatively high prices, but then we'll all expect, at least CCS at industry or point source sources to fall quite rapidly, and the ETS price to go up. So it can be economical rather sooner than later, maybe even. But I think the really bottleneck is the infrastructure. So it's storage, it's pipeline infrastructure, and it's also and this is quite interesting, because we're talking a lot about storage capacity in our carbon management strategy, and our experts, they always say that there's no limitation on storage capacity theoretically. We can store for hundreds of thousands of years, but there is a bottleneck of injection capacity and of readily available storage sites. And there's a pretty neat analysis of yours of the Clean Air Task Force, I suppose, that shows the announced capture volumes in respect to the announced storage projects, and there's a huge gap.
Great, thank you. I don't know if you have any last comments on that question, Marion.
Yeah, two things that I think also maybe get overlooked. I agree with both of the Sam and Pascal mentioned. So thinking a bit more long term, I think permitting is something that I worry about as becoming maybe a bottleneck. We already see that in PV and wind right now. We see that in the US for the IRA, that actually permitting might be the constraining factor for all the money that is available to be paid out. And the other one, and that's even more long term and going also beyond just CCUS infrastructure, is workforce development. So at the size that we will need the CCUS and CDR infrastructure to be at, we will need an immense amount of people. And those are not all just PhDs. Those are people that will operate pyrolysis plants, that will drill wells. And we've already seen that in Iceland. That can be a challenge to find sufficient people to do that, right? And we are seeing that similarly, the analogy in PV already, right? There's a shortage in solar installers. And given the urgency of the climate crisis, we need to make sure that plenty of workforce is there, is retrained or newly trained to go into these jobs. That would also help with public acceptance.
Great, thank you. Thank you all for speaking today. This was a great session. I'm sure everyone in the audience learned a lot. We are at time, so I just want to do a couple wrap-ups. I'm posting our link in the chat for our year one report if you're interested in downloading it and reading about our accomplishments for the year, as well as we have our newsletter that keeps you up to date on our carbon talks and all information going on in the CCUS that we think is relevant. So thank you all for joining today, and I hope you have a good rest of your night. To our European speakers tonight, and thank you all.